Okay, so thanks a lot to Beatriz also for the invitation. It was important for me to come here and also present this work because it's, I think, something that is quite new. Not because biodiversity is a new topic in ports, it isn't. It's a topic that people have been looking at for many, many years. But the ideas that I'm trying to present are a little bit different because what I am trying to look into is whether it is possible to use biodiversity strategically. So whether there are new activities, new business opportunities which are connected with biodiversity. And what most people consider when we look at biodiversity is biodiversity to protect, to close activities, to limit activities. And this is important in some cases because there are no other options, but I think it's even more interesting if we have the possibility of looking at biodiversity as an opportunity to integrate biodiversity in the way businesses are operating. And that's what I am particularly interested. So I work for a business school. I'm not an ecologist. I am a strategy and innovation scholar. So my interest is how companies make money. But of course, not only this, what I'm interested in is also how can we make society a better society, a richer society, a more affluent society. And rich and affluent means in the broader sense, not only money, but also into well-being. And that is what I'm really interested in, and that's what I focus on, with the specific domain of ports and shipping in general. I think this is... So what I will discuss with you is a work in progress, some research that I'm doing. The title that I gave to this presentation is Harboring Nature, which has a little bit this sort of word game. Harboring, of course, in harbors, in ports, but harboring also means protecting. It means also embracing in a way. And that's a little bit the idea is looking at strategic biodiversity management in ports. So it's a little bit more than what we generally look at biodiversity in ports, which is about protection only. We talk about strategic management in this case, which includes also protection and preservation, but not only. So what I would... Dime.
En español también es refugio, los puertos de refugio.
Sí, la idea es esto, precisamente.
Si sabes que buscas la palabra, ya la sabes.
Perfecto, refugio, sí. Something else in relation to the... Oh, I made that mistake here, of course, already. Something I want to mention, this picture here is a picture from which I took myself, is a picture from the harbor of Hamburg, where I used to live. So Hamburg is located, the harbor, the port is located in the middle of the city. You can see here in the back the cranes, but this is a major yard, reparation yard. And you can see also here the richness is a river. It's a very complex riverine system. It's the Elbe River. And you can see here in this picture on a beautiful winter day with the ice on the river, but you can see the birds. So you will see many pictures that I've taken myself, which I really like to combine this integration of nature with man-made construction. And we will discuss, I'll see in a moment, how these things are connected. I just wanted to mention that as well. So what we will be discussing is, I give a very brief introduction on biodiversity, why biodiversity is important today, and why do we pay attention to it. We will focus a little bit more on biodiversity in ports. And then I will have, and these are sort of more introductory concepts, and then I would like also to briefly present some work that I did for the UN Global Compact, where we just launched in December a practical guidelines for ports, which linked to the application of the Sustainable Ocean Principles. So I will explain those things are and why they relate to ports and they are important. Then we will try to look at management theory, a little bit how this management theory can be applied into the case of biodiversity. This is a very difficult topic. Just last year, there was a seminar at the Academy of Management conference, annual conference, which is a big organization of management scholars. And one of the keynote speakers says, there is no business case for biodiversity. And if you say there is no business case for biodiversity, the only option you have, assuming you consider biodiversity as something valuable for society, the only option that you have then is regulation. And I do not fully agree that there is no business case for biodiversity. I think that's what I will try to discuss, whether I convince you, I don't know, maybe not, which is okay. And then we will look at a little bit at the contents of the paper. So I'll discuss methods of what I've done and looking at like an approach, a framework to valorize biodiversity in the context of ports. And then some concluding remarks, and there will be opportunities for questions or any discussions that you might want to have. And that's more or less what I'm planning to discuss. Now, we start with the global biodiversity crisis. You see here a picture which is from last summer. This is a picture from Canada. But unfortunately, it could have been a picture from Greece. It could have been a picture from Italy. It could have been a picture from Spain. It could have been a picture from the US. It could have been a picture from many, many other places. And you can see here a fire which has lost control. Fires have always happened, but the frequency and the intensity and the length of the fires, it's something that is becoming more and more dominant. And these are a big problem. Now, why are fires connected with biodiversity? Is because, of course, fires contribute, together with a lot of other natural phenomena and man-made phenomena, other destruction of biodiversity. Obviously, when you burn large areas of land, you can accelerate desertification, you can accelerate the destruction of some of both fauna and flora, so animal as well as vegetal plant species. And very often this destruction takes a long time to recover. The fire is just a symptom of an overall trend in increased destruction of biodiversity. There are signals that are quite evident and documented by ecologists and naturalists and scientists in various contexts. We have lost a large number of species, both for plants and animals, in the last 60, 100 years, depend on what we count. Unfortunately, the increase in the species loss is going... do we have a marker, maybe? Oh, no. If I can find... Marker? See, no, I don't know if here is something that we can borrow. No?
Yeah.
Ah, perfecto.
No, it's just the typical to work here.
Fantastic, yeah. I'll make sure to return it too. No, what we are observing is that over time, the loss of species has been going like this. So obviously, this is of concern, and this is roughly the last 50 years. And we have seen a deterioration of the protection of the species. Now, this is something that is a cause of concern for two reasons. The first reason is because a lot of those systems and species are interconnected. So if you lose a couple of species, the ecosystems can adapt. But if you have large number of species that are destroyed all at the same time, at a very, very rapid pace, then what you have is the possibility of going towards an extinction. So a mass extinction. And this is not something that will happen today or tomorrow or in 10 years, but there are processes that can be triggered by biodiversity destruction that are very, very difficult to correct. So once a species is gone, it's gone. You cannot resuscitate it. And we can try, but it's very difficult. So there is a direct connection with the loss of species. Now, we could argue that if we do not value biodiversity as humans, then we can lose it. If I don't think that this tree is valuable to be preserved, I can lose it. Now, this is a value judgment. We have to say, okay, what is valuable? The problem is, though, that loss of biodiversity has enormous consequences also for economic activities as well as human well-being. So whatever metric we take, whether we take a pure preservation metric because we value nature in its all complexity, we could say even something that is not useful for humans should be preserved because it's part of the complexity of our planet, or whether we just take a opportunistic or utilitaristic perspective for humans or for human society, the loss of biodiversity has very big consequences, some of which could even reach very serious long-term consequences. In some way, biodiversity losses is a much more dangerous threat to humanity than climate change is. So climate change connects to biodiversity losses, but biodiversity losses can have much bigger consequences for humanity. And the reason for this is that all ecosystems, many of which we are reliant on, because we might forget it sometimes, but we are creatures, living creatures, we are part of ecosystems, although we wear clothes and we live in houses and we use cars and we spend time on the internet, but we depend on natural resources or natural environments for our survival to a very large extent. So big, very substantial disruption can also be threats to humanity. What I want to stress those here, because I'm not an alarmist, and we were discussing with Beatrice, I'm very optimistic. This is not something that is going to happen tomorrow, and there are solutions and things that we can do. But the cost and the difficulties, especially in certain communities, can be very high. Now, this beyond whether we have an individual value of saying, well, I like diverse trees, I like diverse type of plants, I like diverse type of insects, I like the diversity, which might consider that as valuable. So there is quite a lot of discussions on biodiversity. I'll just give here two examples. The first one relates to the so-called windshield phenomenon. That's the funny way of representing something very dramatic, which is the loss of insect biodiversity. Now, as you know, insects are one of the largest type of animal species, living species on the planet, and they are critical for everything that happens in the planet, from pollination to nutrition to the use of fertilization to many systems depend on insects for their functioning. And what we have observed, there are many studies now, but the windfield phenomenon starts from an observation of several scholars, but there is a Danish teacher who used to drive by car regularly, or by bike, as they do in Denmark. And more recently, like in the 90s, he was going by bike with his son. And then he realized that by going by bike, there was something different he was experiencing than the previous years. And what this difference was that he was not getting mosquitoes and insects in his eyes. And then he started doing an experiment with this car, and he monitored how many insects were splattered on the car while driving in certain areas. And this triggered a large project in Denmark. It was 26 years, where they monitored the reduction of insects, and the same thing they did in other countries. There is in Krefeld in Germany, they did also a very thorough study on calculating the amount of insects that were lost. Now, in the German study, they calculated the total mass of insects in various seasons, and they realized that in the last 30 years, the total mass of insects has been reduced 78%. So in 27 years. Okay. So it means that in 27 years, we have 78% in mass of insect loss. Now, of course, this is an indicator because obviously the masses of insects may vary in different periods of the year. In actually the reproductive season of most insects, which is the summer, the reduction was even more severe. It was 86%. That was the reduction that they had observed. And of course, all of this is a fact. The causality is difficult to assess, but ecologists and environmental scholars have identified many causes to these reductions. From pesticides to changes in land use. Changes in land use is very important. When we use monoculture, for example, monocultures harbor fewer insects than other areas. Climate change plays a role there. Pollution plays an important role there. Urbanization and other factors, and of course, any other mechanism. Most of these are anthropogenic, so they are human related. And there is here a little comic. So in the 1990s, there is a lot of insects on the windshield. In 2020, there are no insects. But then in 2050, there are no humans left as well. So we have to, it's a bit of a sad comic in that sense. Now, this is, of course, on land. That's a very clear example. There are many other examples which relate to mammals or plants as well. Especially one issue when we're looking at plants is, as I was mentioning, monoculture and the development of widespread singular species of certain products, typically what we eat. There's only one type of potatoes, which is the one that has been planted by certain large brands that produce French fries, and that becomes the dominant species, dominant typology of potato. And we could consider that why is this potato species been selected? Because in terms of taste, in terms of yield, in terms of resistance to pathogens and so on is much better, and so we cultivate that. And most of the agricultural sector, which is a dominant, very important way in which we are changing the land, both land use as well as the planet, it's linked very much to the selection of those plants for our own benefits. And so, but of course, that implies that there are issues associated with biodiversity, because biodiversity makes ecological system much more resilient. Well, if you're dependent only on one plant and then occasionally you find a certain type of pest that could, for example, affect that plant, you will lose the entire yield. And that is also important to consider. Now, the other point that I want to mention, we're talking about biodiversity, is the ocean biodiversity. I think here in the Canary Islands, you are blessed with a richness in biodiversity, and this is a rather unique ecosystem for many, many reasons. And of course, the oceans are very much exposed also to biodiversity loss. What we think when we think about the oceans is, of course, the loss of overfishing. That's a classic example. But there is much more than overfishing. There is, of course, also acidification. There is disruptions in habitats and many other causes of biodiversity losses. Now, there is a bit of gloom and doom. It's not all gloom and doom, though. There is no gloom and doom because actually, if we look at marine biodiversity, we are protecting now, strictly speaking, the maritime protection and marine protected areas are about 7% of the global oceans. In reality, 7% are those that are formally defined as protected areas. The areas that are really protected are about 2.4, 2.5% of the oceans. Now, so it's quite limited. If we were able to increase this to about 20%, we would be able to preserve 90% of all the biodiversity. So actually, we don't need to protect the entirety of the oceans to preserve the largest majority of biodiversity in the oceans. We need a smaller increase. Unfortunately, the smaller increase is about 45% into territorial and coastal waters, and 6% into deeper ocean, so non-specific territorial waters. Now, of course, that in a way it's easier to regulate because this depends exclusively on one country, but it's also problematic because these are the areas where we tend to have the highest economic activities associated. So it's a trade-off in deciding which areas to protect. But there are side benefits. Classic example here is fisheries. When you have an increase in marine protected areas, what you also have is more fish into the areas where they're not protected. So understanding those relations can help very much into improving biodiversity, preserving biodiversity, and also supporting the system, also the economic systems which are related to that biodiversity. But we have a lot of work to be done to better understand the relations between those systems and specifically the benefits and the relations with human systems. So these are the two examples I wanted to start with. Now we come specifically to ports. Now you see here a picture from California. This is a port area where there are a lot of seals. And the port, this is in San Francisco, the way the port has been built is also creating space which can be used by the seals to visit and to reproduce and to be protected somehow. So in the construction of the port, that has been embedded as part of the way the port has been constructed. And of course, this becomes attractive because it becomes a tourist attraction and it has a set of side benefits in terms of biodiversity. Now, why ports are interesting and important? Well, ports are interesting because they are very, very special locations. So ports are the interaction between very intense human activities, but they are also very often located in very strategic and ecologically sensitive and peculiar areas. Many ports in Northern Europe, typically ports are located on rivers. And rivers are traditionally very complex ecosystems. In other parts of the world, ports might be located in the proximity of cliffs, or they might be interconnecting tidal areas. And these areas tend to have extremely high ecological value. And many ports are also located in the proximity of cities, and we are discovering that biodiversity within cities is changing and is adapting to the city environment. So we cannot really see cities as, they are not dead spaces. They are simply spaces where species are adapting in different ways. And ports are very central into that. Most ports, in a way or another, also are managed by entities that have a certain decisional autonomy. And many, typically port authorities or port management companies or private companies, so these are also spaces that from an administrative perspective have agency. They are controlled somewhat by one entity that can decide and has a mandate. And very often this mandate also includes nature protection, preservation, and to some extent valorization for many port authorities. Not all of them, but many port authorities. There is also something that is happening, and that is that a lot of areas, marine areas and marine protected areas, need to be managed. And very often, the most obvious entity that is typically associated with the management of those marine areas or marine ecosystems ends up being the port. Why? Because lack of alternatives. People in the port have knowledge of the maritime systems. There is expertise. They are obviously also where there is interaction with a lot of maritime activities, from fisheries to research and so on. And so they end up entrusted very often with that task. And this is a bit of an uncomfortable position for many port authorities. It's uncomfortable because ports have, on the one side, the mandate to support economic activities of the port, of the cities, of the communities they have. And now they're also being asked to operate as stewards. And typically, when you try to protect something, there is not a lot of money to be made out of it. You know, if you take this very conservative approach, which is still dominant in a lot of ecological circles, then it becomes very difficult to integrate those two issues. So what I'm arguing is that biodiversity represents, in a way, a challenge for port governance and port managers. And it is an important challenge because of the importance that preservation and management of biodiversity has for communities, for humanity, for countries, for regions. And so I think, and that's a call, that's why this paper, that is valuable for management scholars, economists, port managers to start thinking about biodiversity as an integral part of port management, port development, port strategy, and not only as a constraint into what ports can do. That's the point at the basis here. What I'm also observing is that in general we are lacking business models that look at biodiversity as an integral resource. So if I have a horse, you know, I am an old-fashioned grain mill, no? That's the horse that goes around and pull the what do you call the stone to grind the grain, no? Obviously, that horse is a resource. I can make the horse work, but if I overexhaust the horse, if I keep on beating the horse is gonna die, right? And then I have no horse and I don't have any grain. So a good miller, what will it do? Will use the horse, but it will also feed the horse, will give it water, will give it support, will give sustenance, so that it can maintain its economic activities. With biodiversity, it's actually very similar. I mean, with overfishing, the example is obvious. If you overfish, then you have no fish, and then you have a problem. But with a lot of other biodiversity resources, there are very similar connections. So I think that integrating those into longer-term or medium-term perspectives into businesses is something that is very valuable and long overdue, also within ports. So that's a little bit the idea behind this. Now, biodiversity in ports has been studied extensively, mostly from an ecological point of view. There is this fantastic review study that was published in 2023 that makes a summary of the biodiversity studies in the ports of the world. And as you can see here, you have almost every harbor and every coastal area which has been investigated and ports that have been investigated. And in this case, a lot of focus has been on three key aspects of what is being studied. The first aspect is the anthropic impact, so how are human activities impacting the harbors? The other aspect is knowledge building, so gathering knowledge and understanding what type of biodiversity, what type of species are threatened, are in the ports. And the last aspect is a focus on NIS, which are non-invasive species. So a lot of ecological focus in ports has been highlighting or trying to look at non-invasive species, so species that can destroy the local ecosystem, and they are being imported from far away through ships. And those of you that are familiar with the ballast water problem and issues, that's a very, very hot topic for every ecosystem. So that's something that we are studying and we are understanding. But a lot of those studies, and you could see here also in terms of publication, the increased number of both publications and citations. So this is a topic that from an ecological perspective is established, is studied, and there is a lot of work that has been done. Unfortunately, from a manager, economics, business perspective, there is hardly anything. And my experience is that if something has been studied from a scientific, ecological, naturalistic perspective, at some point it will also translate into business and observations from a business perspective. And that's why I think it's valuable to look into this topic. So these are the elements that I was mentioning. What have been the focus in terms of research? So we have some discrepancies. So there are a lot of focus on certain type of taxonomies, but very little understanding on the interrelations on habitats, also the interrelation between human systems, for example, the type of economic activities that are used in the ports or that are dominant in the port, and the implications on biodiversity, and as well as ecological spillover effect, so how these things interact. There's very little research on that. A lot of focus, as I mentioned, on non-indigenous species or invasive species. In some cases, this has been prioritized by some regions. In Oceania, for example, that's a very hot topic, very, very dominant. And very often, the aspects of non-invasive species, indigenous species, sorry, invasive species, has been mostly driven by economic concerns more than ecological or biodiversity preservation. So that's also another aspect. And very little focus has been on the interaction between socio-ecological or socio-economic and ecological aspects in ports. Now, why this? And I think this could be a long discussion on why interdisciplinary research is difficult in many disciplines, and this is clearly a topic which also falls into one element, certain degree of interdisciplinarity. I think there is still quite a lot of gap into the management and business perspective, but obviously there is quite a lot of interdisciplinarity that relates to the problem. Now, a couple of things I want to mention in the UN Global Compact. So the UN Global Compact is a voluntary mechanism which is organized by the UN, and it brings together corporations. So companies come together and they pledge allegiance, or they pledge to comply or to consider those ocean principles, sustainable ocean principles, as a part of their strategy definition, their business propositions, what they do. And I see this as an interesting perspective, because obviously when we're looking at biodiversity and when we're looking at the oceans or even at ports, we are in domains that very often are, by definition, interacting at an international level. So of course you could put rules on ports and that dominated by the country or the city or whatever other system that is controlling the port. But to a very large extent, these are also systems that are interacting in an international context. For example, ports very often compete with ports which are in other countries. So there are difficulties in implementing certain types of regulations. And regulators, we see that with the discussions on decarbonization, for example, on pollutions, regulators are sometimes constrained in what they can do because they run the risk of affecting the competitiveness of the port. But through initiatives that are driven by the customers of those organizations, of the ports, I think we have the possibility of actually accelerating change, and maybe in some cases more effective. So what the UN Global Compact has done, they have created what they call practical guidelines for all sectors which are associated with the oceans. So they have something on aquaculture, they have something on algae, they have something on wind farms, they have something on shipping. And in 2023, they also released a practical guidelines on ports, which I had the pleasure of coordinating. And in this document, we look at how ports can help into supporting this sustainable ocean principle. Sustainable ocean principles go beyond biodiversity, but biodiversity is very central into that for obvious reasons. And I thought it was interesting to share, as this has been published in December last year, so there is quite a lot of interesting material. What we did in that work, it's not a long document, it's about 40 pages, but it's the result of a year and a half of consultations with a group of 80 experts. And we structured the principle into 6 areas. Now, the first area is probably the one that is most relevant for biodiversity. It connects to ocean health and productivity. And here we discuss strategies, practical strategies that ports can use to support marine biodiversity and leverage on marine biodiversity. The other aspect, so this is one of the core principles of the UN Global Compact. We have the other ones, which is governance and engagement and data transparency. These are the other 2 classic standard principles. They are relevant for ports as well. But for the case of ports, we added also 3 more: climate resilience, just energy transition, and finance. So those 3 principles we added into trying to really identify what is critical for ports to support the sustainable ocean principles. And we identify that for ports, a just transition is fundamental. Finance and financing is a fundamental element. And of course, we also have climate resilience, as ports are also increasingly being very severely exposed to climate negative impacts. So that's to give you a little bit of an overview. The guidelines is available for free, so if you're interested in reading it, please feel free to do so. Now, what I would like to discuss now is, this is give you a little bit of a background of the problem. Now, as a scholar, what I start looking at is, okay, what approaches can we use to structure this problem in a managerial or in a economic perspective? Because I believe that those frameworks can help us break down complex problems and give us angles to look at the problems and maybe eventually find solutions. So the first theory that I came across was the theory of natural capitalism. Now, this is a theory that was a result of, it's been quite impactful, published in 1999. And the idea here is that when we're looking, it's a little bit what I was anticipating before. When we are looking at resources like the horse in an integrated manner with a sort of a longer term perspective, we realize that actually the protection of certain resources, the preservation or valorization of those resources can actually be very important for business. And the difference in the case of the horse is, of course, I can keep the horse alive, barely alive, and he will produce. But if I help the horse, giving maybe good food or nutrients, maybe he will produce also more. And the same thing is also with a lot of the natural resources. Now, the theory has various angles that I think are interesting. The first one is, of course, this principle, which is quite straightforward. Another principle, which is very important, is this principle of biomimicry. And so the idea of biomimicry is that a lot of natural ecosystems are very resilient and they are very productive because they account for complex interactions in the systems. And many economic systems tend to be much more linear. And this linearity very often makes these systems much more vulnerable, much more exposed, less resilient. So by looking and studying how natural systems and processes work, we could actually learn and adapt some of our economic systems and improve their resilience in general. So that's another aspect that is used. The other point that is used is this focus on service and flow economy. And the idea here is that moving from an economy which is based on the physical product is away from this type of economy tends to have positive effects if we move towards an economy which is based on services. What I mean by this is that instead of just, for example, allocate a piece of land and selling that piece of land to some individual, what I could do is I can use this land and make this land accessible to a larger number of people, and that can increase the benefit. And this has been a principle that has been used extensively into a lot of market activities. You know, nowadays it's the sharing, it's at the basis of the sharing economy. We don't own a car, we rent it, we don't own a bike, we take it when we need it. And of course this can have very, very important consequences on biodiversity. And ultimately is this idea that natural capital, like financial capital, it's something that we can invest on. So we can look at natural capital not as something that is given, that is always available, that is limitless, but we could look at it as something that we could manage. And this connects very much also with a concept that was developed by the Club of Rome a few years back. And the Club of Rome says, well, we live in a world which is different from what was 100 years ago. Why is it different? Because the world we lived 100 years ago, we were this, and this was the natural environment we were in. So we had such a large amount of natural resources that we could consider for any practical purposes these natural resources as unlimited. Now, the difference today is that our footprint into the natural environment is much larger, which means that we do have some of those resources that start becoming scarce. Now, if resources are scarce, they need to be managed. If resources are scarce, they need to be regenerated. And think of things such as water, things such as rare earths or even fossil fuels. So all those activities are starting today to be constrained, and we have the possibility of managing them. Now, with biodiversity, we have the fantastic element that a lot of these resources, this natural capital, can be regenerated. So it's not like oil that once it's burnt, it's burnt. With a lot of biodiversity and natural resources, they can be fostered, they can be generated, they can be grown, we can invest in them and get higher returns depending on what we do. And I think that's also a very interesting concept from this idea of natural capitalism. There's a couple of other theories that I think are relevant when we're looking at ports. The other one is this idea of stewardship. That's also work that goes back to the 90s, this idea of stewardship. I mean, it's not rocket science really, but the idea here is to sort of start looking at the fact that firms, individual firms, are not only exploitative enterprises. There is a component of that, we could look at them only as exploitative enterprises, but they also have a role of stewardship. The same way that the miller can not only exploit the horse, it also has to feed the horse to be able to maintain that production. And the same thing is with what firms should be doing. If a firm destroys its sources of competitive advantage or its sources of growth or its sources of wealth, in reality it's a firm which will not be sustainable. And of course we could imagine different business models, maybe business models that destroy and then move to something else. But there is a lost opportunity there because once you have destroyed that resource, you're not going to get it back. And imagine land, for example. I had a PhD student working on the topic of land in ports. If you exploit the land to the point that the land is become barren, maybe even exposed to destruction because of the natural elements, you have lost that resource. But if you invest a little bit into that land and try to maintain, to exploit it into a sustainable manner, acting as a steward to that land, the value of that land will going to stay for a much longer period of time. So if your land is unlimited, you could use that portion of land and then move somewhere else. But increasingly, land is not available. Imagine in ports, you have an area in the port. If you're exploiting this area until there is nothing left, you cannot use it anymore. Well, that area will become a cost for society or a cost for you. So then you can be a smart firm and just try to get out legally outside of your obligation to the management of the land. But someone will have to pay for the cleaning or the reinstating of that area. And so this element of stewardship is connected to that. So Firms act in a way also as guardian of the resources, and they can effectively operate in that sense. They have the means. And there are some examples here that are relevant also for ports. So one of them is sustainable supply chain management, the role of community engagement, and environmental restoration that is becoming an integral part of what firms are doing. Another aspect is linked to the resource-based view, which is a dominant theory in management. And the idea here is to look at resources, and the combination of resources is really what generates a competitive advantage for firms. And you could consider that we have tangible and intangible resources, and looking at natural resources or natural capital into this framework can allow us to actually say, well, there are certain aspects into the natural environment that can be seen as resources. Effectively, they enter the production function in a way, although we forget that they are there, but they are part of that. And by including them in our reasoning, that could actually help us to find better ways to combine resources so that we are competitive. That's another approach we could consider. And then very important is the topic of ecosystem services and linked to the biodiversity imports. Now, there is quite a lot of work that has been done on ecosystem services. The idea here is that at the basis we have biophysical structure and processes, photosynthesis, tides, and anything that relates to the natural environment. Now, those activities, they will pass on certain functions that we tend to take for granted, for example, water filtration, or for example, air cleaning. They offer in this way certain type of services, for example, flood protection, or certain products that we are able, the things that we get, for example, from agriculture. And they have specific benefits which are to health, to society, even our well-being in walking around on the beach, to economic value, so the willingness to pay for the preservation of those services. So those linkages here between the ecosystem, biodiversity, and the human well-being, it's something that has generally not been extensively studied and understood. And we can develop institutions and mechanisms that try to account for the interaction between ecosystems and the value that we as humans attribute to some of their services and the products that are generated by these ecosystems. So how do we do that? Well, we have the possibility of managing or restoring those ecosystems better, and those restored ecosystems will deliver higher benefits, and they end up being much more valuable. Now, that's very different. So you can see here that ultimately there is a focus also on the human well-being, but it's very different than just focusing on this element here, because if we only look at the benefits and the economic valuation of the benefits, which is what is very often typically done in cost-benefit analysis, for example, we are missing the fact that there are a lot of interlinked processes and co-benefits which are related to the way the ecosystems are managed here. And I'll give you an example. I might, for example, consider what is the value of a beach. So I need to expand a port. I need to destroy a portion of the beach. This happens sometimes. So obviously I can consider the value of the land. I can consider the direct benefits that the citizens of the city have by using that beach. But I could also look at it in a much larger perspective into, for example, the type of marine ecosystems that are supported by that beach. Or I can even look at the fact that there are interrelations between the existence of that beach and some other systems. And that makes it, of course, much more complex, much more holistic. And that's typically also what this type of mechanism look at. It's a little bit difficult to see. But the idea here is to go beyond the monetary evaluation. Monetary evaluation is one of the metrics, but there are other services and systems and other value concepts that are very difficult to capture in a monetary dimension, and in a way or another should be accounted for. And again, this is not only about preservation, it's also very much about valorization, because maybe what a firm is delivering is not only the value, but there are also other co-benefits which are associated with that. And that's, I think, it's also a different perspective that can be used in the case of ports. Now, those systems are somewhat the theories that inform the study that I wanted to explore. And it is an exploratory study, so this was a qualitative study where I investigated 3 specific ports. I tried to cover, of course, apart from the literature, I tried to cover the geographical diversity of the ports, looking at leadership in biodiversity initiatives in ports, and then also discuss with experts to try to validate some of the observations that I had. So what I did here was looking at various ports around the world, ports that I had access to, and ports that were identified as leader in the biodiversity preservation, to understand what are they doing, and also to say, if those that we are considering leaders are unable to do this, well, probably cannot be done, or maybe they have the resources, or maybe they are doing something in that direction. So I really wanted to understand, and I think you can learn in this context from the best, at least from those that are perceived the best. I don't say that there might be lessons to be learned also maybe from smaller ports, might be the case, but that was where we started from. So the ports that I had selected were three. We selected the Port of Vancouver in North America, in Canada, the Port of Rotterdam, and the Port of Brisbane. Now, these are, of course, very different ports, both in terms of their dimension, the typologies of traffic, their organizational structure, and the environmental priorities that they had. Now, obviously, the Port of Vancouver is the largest port in Canada. It is a port which acts primarily as an import port for the local regions, but also as an export port from energy commodities. It is also located in areas which are characterized by rather pristine and uncontaminated nature. And also, culturally, the location is dominated by quite a lot of attention to environmental issues. The port is next to the city. It has hence also a relation, very close relation with the stakeholders, which require also in some cases expect the port to be proactive in the preservation of biodiversity, or certainly when it comes down to environmental impact reduction. Now, the Port of Rotterdam is the largest port in Europe. It is mostly an industrial port. It's a port which is located in one of the most heavily, densely populated areas in Europe. The Netherlands is one of the highest population density. And it is in the middle of industry and city. So you would imagine there's no biodiversity left in Rotterdam to preserve, but actually there is. And I'll discuss that in a moment. You can see here, maybe it's not very clear, there is a little orchid here, which is unique in the area of Rotterdam. And that is a form of biodiversity that the port has recognized and is trying to preserve. And then we have the example of Brisbane in Australia. And Port of Brisbane is one of the largest ports in Australia. It's a multi-purpose port. But it really, what was interesting is that they really have a very strong focus on the preservation of biodiversity. That is one of the ways in which, with a lot of transparency and a lot of information sharing, they really built a very strong biodiversity consciousness within the port. Now, you see here two pictures of the ports. Now, this is a New Brighton Park shoreline habitat restoration project. This is in the Port of Vancouver. So what you could see here is some of the industrial activities of the port. All this area here used to be an urban park, but it was redeveloped, creating the possibility for some riverine species to create reproduction areas, and also to facilitate the development of certain plants. Of course, in Vancouver, what is also very important is the relationship with the indigenous population, the First Nations, and these areas also have very important symbolic value for the traditional cultures in the area. And they were restored by the port. There are various areas which were redone in terms of restoration. And this has been done in various ways. It created not only ecological benefits, but also societal benefits and preservation, of course, also of human cultures in a way. Now, you see here the example of Rotterdam. That's very different. I was able to get in both cities a sunny day for the pictures, because generally there's a lot of fog and gray. And this is right in the city center of Rotterdam. Now, what you see here is, of course, a lot of building. But you see here one of the offices. This is called Rotterdam Floating Office. And there is here a park. Now, if you go to this park in the center of Rotterdam in summer, you will see people going and swimming. They go and jump in the water. There is an entire ecosystem that has been redeveloped, allowing for certain species, for example, to grow into the bottom of the floating platforms. And so this has also generated urban biodiversity with an increase in insect population and birds, and also the preservation of some of the other species. So that is part of the efforts that these ports are doing, and of course much more can be done. So how are the ports focusing on biodiversity? I'm putting here some biodiversity highlights. This is maybe a little precise. When we're looking at Vancouver, operating within a very rich environment, the presence of marine mammals,
riverine ecosystems. When we're looking at the Port of Rotterdam, home to a variety of specialized species that are getting lost, from orchids to cattle to seals to toads and other elements. More than 200 unique and threatened plant and animal species which operate within the port area. And then when you're looking here at the Port of Brisbane, a very close integration with the maritime ecosystem, especially protection of the seagrass bed, 352 hectares of mangroves, and 60,000 migratory shore birds which visit annually. And all of this, of course, it's in the areas which are controlled and managed by the port. And these are valuable resources. These are not just birds and plants. This is something that can be leveraged on if we account for them as resources. That's the idea. Now, I'll start a little bit more in detail with the circumstances here. So what is the Port of Vancouver doing specifically? How are they managing this? They have various programs. They have a very active support of the species at risk. So you see here, this is where the city of Vancouver is. Well, all of this is North Vancouver, and all of this part here is urbanized area. Most areas of the port operations are now located into here. Here you have the causeway, which allows to go to Vancouver Island. And here you have the older part of town, so to speak. And you can see that the areas controlled by the port are very extensive, very large, and they are really interacting between city, urban, and natural environments. And they are very interesting programs that they're also using, not only for the reduction, for example, of noise and responsible land and water management, but also, for example, ways of measuring every action that they are doing. It is also accounted for in terms of environmental impacts, typically carbon emissions, but also nature preservation. And so there is the attempt that for everything that the port is doing to reestablish that balance. If you build a certain area, you have to have somewhat accumulated environmental credits in some other area so that you maintain a stable or even increase the amount of nature, so to speak, that you have within the port. If you look at the Port of Rotterdam, also very, very active selection here. Here you see all the blue dots are biodiversity examples. There is a nature vision for the port. Obviously, this is an area that is riverine, intertidal, very close again with nature and the city. And also here, trying to avoid the destruction of the species, the loss of the species, and building and connecting with nature. And I think here I had put a small video from the Port of Rotterdam. It's just one minute. It's a documentary that was published a year ago on the nature in the Port of Rotterdam. Let's see if it works. And that can show you also what you can find in the port. This is what we are familiar with when we look at ports. This is a little bit less familiar. So this is just the trailer of the documentary. Obviously, there is a full movie that shows all the details. It was extremely successful in the Netherlands and in various film festivals. And I think it gives a very different perspective of the way, if you have ever had visited Rotterdam, it's a very industrial area. You know, it's
buildings and infrastructure everywhere. So I think to see that nature has been able to reintegrate with the port with some proactive actions from the Port Authority is interesting. And then here, this last example is the one from the Port of Brisbane. You see here what they have been doing. They have been able to increase the seagrass bed adjacent to the port from 4.4 square kilometer to 14 square kilometer, so very successful. The port is also responsible for the management of those islands and with the mangroves forest in that areas. And obviously, you probably are very familiar with the fact that mangroves are an extremely important protection for example, floods and especially storms and hurricanes and so on. So you could see here that clearly there is an element of co-benefit. The seawall maintenance, the weed management, and so on, and some of the other characteristics that the port is doing. So by comparing the world of the ports, I try to observe what were the main benefits that were associated with biodiversity. Well, obviously we have traditional benefits which are associated with any environmental activities. For example, the reduction of reputational risk, the improvement into the stakeholder management, branding. So those are elements which are associated with strengthening the position of the port, just creating a stronger brand to some extent or managing the stakeholders better. These are very important because, of course, having a strong brand or having a strong management of the stakeholders can be quite valuable. And these are benefits which are acknowledged directly by the port. Then another element which is identified specifically in the Port of Rotterdam and the Port of Brisbane is infrastructure resilience. So obviously making the infrastructure better prepared to emergencies, to floods, to climate change, to whatever is in there. You also have the element of sustainable tourism, which is recognized both in Rotterdam and in Brisbane as a direct benefit. Obviously, you have elements of regulatory compliance, and some of those interventions are embedded within regulatory framework, which is something we need to consider. Nobody mentioned specifically employee morale and recruitment, although this is very often something that has been mentioned as part of the benefits of biodiversity management. We have research and development opportunities. They are explicitly mentioned in Vancouver, not in the other ports. Access to green financing, also a side benefit, is not mentioned in either of the ports. Long-term viability of the port activities, as seen as all of them. This is also linked to this concept of looking at future-ready ports. This idea of future-ready organization is something that is very relevant in all of three. Strengthen the community relations, that's linked to the stakeholders management, and of course also being identified as global leader when it comes down to biodiversity. So as you can see here, all the things I'm mentioning here, these are all benefits that can be easily translated also into monetary benefits for the organization. And they are all linked and recognized with biodiversity. Now, some further comparative insights. What are the things that have been looked for? So I mentioned already the future-ready focus. So obviously biodiversity seems to be associated with organizations that are forward-looking, that want to consolidate their future. They want to be there in the future and want to be recognized as that. But there are other important aspects. Obviously, there is a strong focus on the region. That's why also biodiversity can really anchor the activities of the port in the local community. It can help building that sort of synergy, that connection with the region, because a lot of biodiversity is specifically anchored into the characteristics of the region, the ecological characteristics of the region. It also allows for the exploration and the development of new innovations, innovative solutions. So in Brisbane, for example, the use of renewable energy and integration of renewable energy with some of the activities of the port. Rotterdam and Vancouver started exploring with the habitat re-enhancement. I think San Francisco is also a wonderful example in that sense. And this also creates value for the local communities, for the real estate market, for the citizens in general. This community and stakeholder engagement, that's pretty clear, and that's similar to all. The balancing of the industrial activities, so that helps also reducing the negative environmental impacts of the industrial activities, both in terms of climate change, in terms of water pollution, in terms of air pollution. Biodiversity management can counteract some of those activities, can make it much easier to manage the negative impact of those infrastructure. I'll give you an example. If you have a problem with heat, of course, if you put all the buildings and all the industrial constructions together, managing the heat, for example, from the sun is going to be very difficult. If you intertwine those industrial facilities with green spaces, you are able to reduce
the heat in the buildings or in the area much extensively. And that has economic benefits, well-being benefits, and that's an example of how you can balance and integrate industrial activities with nature. And then adaptive management approaches that has a strong focus, of course, on resilience. And of course, as I mentioned, climate change, I'm not discussing this specifically, but climate change in ports is also a big priority. So there are somewhat hidden values in the biodiversity. We've identified 3 elements which indicate that this biodiversity is something that has value, has strategic value. And here you can probably recognize some form of FRIO analysis, which is typically what is used in the resource-based view to assess the strategic value of a resource. And here you have that biodiversity can be rare, can be perceived as rare. It cannot be easily duplicated, and it cannot be easily substituted. And if a resource is rare, inimitable, and cannot be substituted, that's something that generally it's perceived as valuable. But what is missing into this framework is the organizational capabilities to leverage on that resource. So we have value, something that is unique, something that it's specific to the place where I am. But what maybe we need to put a lot of focus on is trying to understand how to leverage on this resource, because we haven't done that. The only way we look at nature, it's something that needs to be fetishized. You know, it's there, and we need to do nothing with it. And conservation is an important part, but valorization is an equally important part. That's something that we need to still explore, especially, I consider also in ports. And so, case for biodiversity protection and valorization, I think these are what we observe by merging and applying the management approaches that I was mentioning. The ability for ports to differentiate, manage risk better, engage better with the stakeholders, innovate and learn, and a long-term viability of port activities. So those are clear cases for supporting, from a managerial and economic perspective, biodiversity in the port. We have most biodiversity activities which are at the moment still though reactive, they're not proactive. And I think ports' specific position will actually strengthen the importance of biodiversity. And we have, of course, the need, and that's what I am endeavor to do in the future, to look at more innovative business models that account for biodiversity as well. So from a practical recommendation, where do ports or should ports start from? Well, on the one side, they could start measuring the natural capital. I think there are examples where ports are doing this. So measuring these resources that are available to them. Identify the ecosystem services. So what are the benefits that biodiversity is providing to the port? Is it ecological tourism? Is it protection from flood? Is it resilience? Is it a reduction in cost in some forms? So all those benefits are very often not automatically identified with the biodiversity. Identify what is unique about the port, because that is rare. It's probably even more valuable. Are there any business activities that are associated or can emerge from the ecosystems, traditional, whether they're fisheries or new, tourism? And then develop a biodiversity value chain. So a value chain in the port which allow to link forms of competitive advantage for the port to some of the biodiversity resources they have. This is, I think, is a starting point from a practical perspective of what ports can do. So, to conclude, ports their role is changing. It's changing because they are increasingly being entrusted with protecting biodiversity ecosystems. They are, in some cases, the pressure comes from their local communities. In some cases, comes from maybe visionary leadership. In some cases, come from the desire to be leaders into this, or strengthen their brand. But we can see that biodiversity is becoming quite central in the way ports operate. And that calls, of course, for reassessing the way ports are managed, maybe creating specific biodiversity protection or valorization figures within the ports. And the free ports offer very interesting lessons, not only because they are quite proactive into the management of the biodiversity, and I think in that sense, this is something that is, of course, very positive already, but they have, each one of them in their own way, integrated or started integrating biodiversity into the way the port is operating. Of course, this is not the end of the road. This is, I think, just the beginning when it comes down to biodiversity. Much more can be done and probably should be done. I think that concludes what I wanted to share. And of course, we still have a little bit of time in case there are any comments or questions from the audience or any further things that maybe are not clear. And
thank you very much
thank you.
for your presentation, very interesting. You have been presenting leading ports
Mhm.
with examples, best practices in terms of managing biodiversity. My question is, are they three private and public ports? Second, what were the incentives? Have you investigated the incentives of these ports to invest?
That was for me also very, very important. So all three ports have a public component. The Port of Rotterdam is organized as a corporation, but the corporation is fully owned, so it operates as a private company, but the shares of the corporations are owned by the government, the municipal government and the national Dutch government. The Rotterdam had a very long-standing tradition of nature preservation that came, I think, historically probably from the time where the port was a public agency. So the port started as a component of the city. And I think there, this element of stewardship and preservation was dominant. I think these are also areas, the Netherlands, which are where nature is very much under pressure because of anthropology.